To our webinar. Today, we have Bob with us, who will talk about risk management in the pharmaceutical sector. Now, back in 2002, the FDA announced its pharmaceutical current good manufacturing practice for the 21st century and talked about a risk-based approach. And it was all about a better approach to enhancing and modernizing the regulation of pharmaceutical manufacture and having really good product quality and really encouraging that risk-based approach. We are incredibly lucky today as we have Bob Hayes with us, who has a wealth of experience in this topic area and is going to share all his insights and bits of information from all that experience in all the roles he's done. Bob is also Vice Chair of the IMechE Pharma Technical Advisory Committee. And it will just be really great today where Bob will talk about where, when it's used properly, risk management is an incredibly useful tool that really benefits not just companies, but obviously the people we really care about, our patients. So there will be time for questions at the end. So please add your questions into the box in the webinar, and we will do our absolute best to answer as many as we possibly can. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Bob.
Claire, thank you for that introduction. Good. I'm going to turn my camera off while we're presenting, just to save a little bit of bandwidth, and start with an introductory slide on risk management. And you'll see that the hand is very neatly placed between the falling dominoes to stop the risk propagating further into the organisation. Now, risk is generally defined as the combination of the probability of an occurrence and the harm. I'll start again, shall I? The probability of the occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. And it's a function of those two considerations. And that's taken straight from IMechE Q9, which I'll refer to a little bit later. But if you look at most risk management methodologies, that's the basis of it. There are some modifications. We'll talk about one called failure mode effect analysis a bit further on. Which includes this and a little bit more, but this is really what risk is. It's the chance of something going wrong that's going to be harmful and how harmful it's going to be. Everything we do has got risk associated with it. For the most part, we manage it sort of automatically, but within a number of industries, we have to take a more structured approach, and pharmaceuticals being one of them, and of course you can think of others such as food, nuclear, aerospace and the like. Now, just to go into the chronology, and Claire did mention this, that from the FDA's perspective, and the FDA were the initiators of this drive towards a risk-based approach in pharmaceutical manufacturing. The last major revision they had was 1978. So a good many years later, in 2002, as Claire said, they published the position paper, Pharmaceutical CGMPs for the 21st century, the risk-based approach. They followed up with a couple of progress reports, and then in September 2004, they published their final report. If you haven't read it, it's a good read. It's easy enough to find. The FDA website has got a huge amount of information on it, which is a good thing and a bad thing, because if you try to use the FDA's own search facility, you tend to get into a bit of a mess. So it's always better just to take the title, drop it into your normal search engine, Google or whatever, and let the search engine do the work. So they published the final report in 2004 after a couple of years of intensive work, and they were looking not only at their own operations, but they're looking at operations within other regulatory authorities around the world. And in the same year, September 2004, they introduced a risk-based method for prioritizing CGMP inspections. So they actually adopted the methodology themselves and said, well, okay, well, we've got a perceived higher risk, and we've looked at previous history and various other factors, then we're going to inspect more frequently, and where companies are doing a good job and clearly don't present much of a risk to the consumer, then we can scale our inspection frequency back a little bit. And they started that pilot in 2005. And other regulators subsequently have taken that approach, and certainly our own regulator in the UK, the MHRA, take very much a risk-based approach, and the frequency of regulation is determined by the previous inspection history and a number of other factors which they take into account. Also in 2004, in September, they published a very interesting a guidance paper called PAT, which was Process Analytical Technology. This is a framework for innovative development, manufacturing and quality assurance. And PAT is really aligns itself to taking appropriate and timely measurements at the time of production to determine quality and manage quality and control poor quality, rather than waiting until you finish making the stuff, stick it into a lab, and then 2 weeks later finding out you did something wrong. So it's using online systems to measure and monitor. But again, it's a very useful document. If you haven't read it, I would recommend it to you. And then 2006, the FDA adopted the Guidance for Industry Q9 as part of, the ICH publication, Q9 Quality Risk Management. The FDA adopted it as part of their Guidance for Industry series. And the interesting thing with this is it's also been adopted by the European Union. I'll talk about that again in a second. September 2006, another guidance document, Quality Systems Approach to Pharmaceutical CGMP Regulations, which again focused on using a risk-based approach, but also said how the quality systems within an organisation should be a system, not just a series of discrete activities. And I think any of us who have been in the industry for some time will see that often you have this significant division between perhaps production operations, the quality group, the research and development people, and the two don't talk to each other that well, and don't work together that well, and you don't have much joined up thinking. Certainly in my early days in the industry, that was very much the case. I do hope it's getting better. And then the last one on my list there is the process validation. Again, the FDA's Guidance for Industry series, general principles and practices, and they incorporated a lot of the comments from the previous guidance and position papers into that revision of how we should be validating our processes. So there's some very good stuff that the FDA have published. Anybody who's worked with me and knows me knows that I do like the FDA. It's a very, very useful reference source. They are probably the world's most powerful regulator. They're a group of experts, and they publish a whole load of guidance documents that are there for the taking. They're free downloads, PDF files, and you don't have to pay for them. I prefer that to going out and buying some expensive guides from commercial organisations. Now, the guiding principles that came out of this final report, CGMPs for the 21st century, the top one is a risk-based orientation. And they said we must consider the risk to the patient in everything we do, because ultimately the patient is taking the product on trust. If you've got a white pill in a box, you don't know what's in it. You have to trust everybody in that supply chain, from the prescribing GP back through the supply chain to the manufacturer of the raw material. You have to trust that they've done it right, because you wouldn't know. A white pill's a white pill, and it could have anything in it. It also talked about science-based policies and standards. And surprisingly, the industry isn't that good at using science when it's making decisions and putting policies in place. It talked about the integrated quality systems orientation, which was mentioned on the previous slide, and international cooperation, such that the agencies globally would be working together. But underpinning it all was this need for strong public health protection, because we are providing drugs for people to hopefully cure illnesses, to make them feel better, and to preserve life. And the last thing we want to do is to compromise that in any way and put the patient at harm. Now, ICH Q9. ICH, for those who don't know, the International Conference on Harmonisation, is a cross-country group consisting of the regulatory bodies with a number of other bodies involved as observers and contributors. The likes of the World Health Organization, for example, are a participant. And they produced a very useful guidance document, ICH Q9, that was adopted in 2005. Again, if you haven't got it, I suggest you get hold of it. It's very, very useful and very good. And also alongside that, they produced a briefing pack, which came out the following year, 2006. Now, the briefing pack is just that. It's not the guidance, it's not the policy, it's a briefing pack, but it's a large document. It's got lots and lots of useful information, various tools and techniques are explained, there's examples, and there's some very wise words in there. Now, ICH Q9, the guidance document, was adopted by the FDA in 2006, and it was included within the EU GMPs in 2008. Initially as Annex 20, but subsequently it went into Part 3 of the European Code of GMP. Now, the interesting thing here is that we've got a common document that is used by both the FDA and the European Union, and that's a first. There has been a revision to it. This came out last year, and it's been adopted by the members of the Assembly, and it's in use within a number of regulatory bodies globally, including our very own MHRA. Now, when you're using a risk-based approach, it applies to all stages of the life cycle, from discovery of the product right through to commercialization. Perhaps when it goes off patent, it will go into over-the-counter rather than prescription, up to the very point it's discontinued. So all points of the product life cycle, risk-based approach is relevant. And it's very relevant in manufacturing, which is GMP, good manufacturing practice, and distribution, good distribution practice activities. And it should be used. The regulators are expecting it, so it should be used on a regular basis. And it's applied to any part of the process where there's a risk to the patient. So the processes that you use within your organizations need to be understood, and the effect of things going wrong within any part of the process needs to be understood, and whether that has an impact on patient safety needs to be understood. And this should be documented, including decisions not to complete a formal risk assessment, because what any inspector is looking for, what any auditor is looking for, is that you've thought about these things. And just to not do something doesn't necessarily indicate you've thought about it. If you've documented that we looked at this and decided it wasn't necessary, then that's documented proof that you've made a decision, a conscious decision, not to take it any further, or if the risk is high enough, then you've gone through a formal risk assessment process. It's the old adage, isn't it? If it's not written down, it's only a rumour. And if it's written down and not signed and dated, it's graffiti. So do make sure you've got this audit trail of the thought process that you've gone through to demonstrate to any visiting auditor, inspector, that you've managed the process properly. The two primary principles of risk management are that you evaluate the risk based on some scientific knowledge, not just guessing, not just somebody's opinion. And this could include issues where product availability may be impacted, because there's obviously potential harm if drugs are in short supply. And you've got to balance that against the level of effort, formality, and how much effort you put into doing the risk management process. So prioritize your risk management activities. Make sure that you deal with the highest risks first and put the effort into them, and the things which are a lower risk should come further down the pecking order. It doesn't mean to say you don't deal with the things of lower risk, but you've got to do some things in the right sort of order to make sure that you're providing safety to patients. What we've seen in the industry is it's been a bit slow to pick things up. It's an industry that's not that comfortable with changing things. You hear various excuses, and often it's a thought that the regulator won't be happy if we start making change. It's all right now, so if we don't touch anything, it'll be all right tomorrow. It's not really the case. Regulators are pushing very hard for companies to improve their operations. There's been a big push from the FDA, and there's been a big push in the European Union to look at better, more efficient, more effective ways of working in the pharmaceutical industry. Compared with other industries, it is actually quite a long way behind in terms of quality systems and operational systems. But where companies have used risk management and done it effectively, they've focused on the things that are really important and forgot about the things that are trivia, because there's a lot of trivia in the industry that gets high profile and gets a lot of resource thrown at it, but it's actually probably not necessary. So the benefit, of course, is better use of resources. You're using the resources where they're going to give you the most bang for the buck. But as I mentioned earlier, you're able to demonstrate control of the process to both customers and to regulators. But we have seen, those of us who have been out, looked at various companies around the place, that implementation is just a little bit patchy, and it's not always quite as optimal as it should be. For those of you familiar with ICH Q9, you'll have seen this. This is breaking the risk management process into 3 stages. Starting off with assessing the risk. How big is it? How often is it going to happen? What's the impact going to be to the customer? The next thing is to try to understand how we can control the risk to bring that risk to the patient down to a manageable, acceptable level. It's very rare that you can remove risk altogether, so you have to determine at what level you say, okay, we've done enough, we'll move on to the next thing. And then the third stage is risk review, which is an ongoing monitoring of the risk, and whether that risk is still under control, whether things have improved or whether things have deteriorated. And alongside that is communication, so that all key players within the process understand and know what's going on. So the first part of it, and my computer has decided to play up. Let's get there. There we go. We should be on a slide saying risk assessment. There we go, that's it. First of all, we identify the risk. So we look at our process, we break it down. The easy way to do this is to put it onto a flow chart and to paste it up on the wall so that everybody can see it and get involved. And the best way to flow chart any process is to get the people who actually do the job to do it for you or do it with you, because they know every last little step. They know what can go wrong. They know what little shortcuts that people take. They'll be familiar with the documentation, be familiar with any equipment that might be in use. They'll be familiar with the interactions with other departments, etc., etc. So always, when you're doing flow charting, involve the people doing the job. And within that flow chart, we can identify the various steps, the various decision-making points, and the various hazards, threats, risks that can come from any of those points on the flow chart should anything go wrong. We then need to analyze the risk and say, okay, well, what is the risk? What does it look like? How big is it? How difficult is it going to be for the patient? How often is it likely to happen? So we're doing the analysis, and then we do some form of evaluation to apportion a score to that risk and give it a prioritization against the other risks that will appear within that process. And there will be a lot. You know, you've got a fairly complex process, such as a packaging line or a bulk manufacturing operation or perhaps a formulation suite. There will be a lot of potential risks within that. So you do need to have some sort of qualification of those risks so that you have an order of priority and things you're going to work on. So what might go wrong? What's the likelihood of it going wrong? And what are the consequences of it going on? The next step is to control it. So it's a decision-making process to reduce the risks, or in some cases to accept the risks. Where we can, we'll reduce the risk. As I said earlier, it's usually very difficult to eliminate risks altogether, but that should be the ultimate goal. But we want to reduce the risk such that the risk is no longer a serious and significant threat to the user. And then there will be a decision to accept the new level of risk compared with the old level of risk. So there will be a few questions in there. Is the risk above an acceptable level? If it is, what can we do to reduce or eliminate it? What's the balance between benefits, risks, and resources? Because sometimes in reducing one risk, you can elevate another risk within that process. So we've got to make sure that we haven't upset the balance elsewhere in the process, or perhaps even introduce some new risks as a result of curing one of the ones that we identified in the first instance. And then the final stage is the communication and review. Communication obviously is sharing information about risk and risk management between the decision makers and others. And then the review process, which is a periodic revisit of our process to say, okay, well, is it doing what we thought it was going to do? We said it was a risk at a high level previously. We've implemented some changes based on our understanding of the process. We've reduced the risk to an acceptable level. So 3 months, 6 months, 12 months down the line, are we maintaining that level? And if we're not, we need to know why, and we need to go back and visit it. If things have improved, what have we done better than we thought we were going to do? And if things haven't improved to the level we thought we had, what have we not? What have we missed? What's gone wrong? What do we need to readdress? And you'd include this in your product review process, annual review, to make sure it's done periodically, and of course you would document it. Now, as I said, there are various tools and techniques. Some of you may be familiar with these. If you strip them back, take the wallpaper off these things, they've all got the basic same framework. It's about the risk to the end user, it's the seriousness of the risk, and it's the likelihood of it occurring. They do have differences in the way they're presented. They are used by different industry. For example, HACCP, Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. That was developed by Pillsbury for NASA, for the space race, getting man on the moon. And that's now become an accepted standard in the food industry. Failure mode effect analysis, very popular in manufacturing industries, and that's the one I'll focus on for the rest of the presentation. There's another one called hazard and operability studies. This is a chemical industry standard. For those of you who are based in the UK and of a certain age, you may remember Flixborough. After the large Flixborough explosion, the chemical industry decided, and I think it was British Petroleum, that they needed to have a more formalised process to understanding and managing risks within petrochemical operations. Fault tree analysis is very much a top-down approach, and for anybody who's been trained in the Kettner-Trigo technique, you'll be familiar with potential problem analysis. But we'll focus on failure mode effect analysis. Now, this is actually a bit of rocket science. I think it's quite exciting because it was developed in the 1940s with the introduction of a US military standard 1629. So it's been around a hell of a long time, but it's not used quite as widely as you might think. What it was the Americans, after the Second World War, they'd got a lot of German technology at their fingertips. I think they've got some of the scientists over as well, and they were trying to develop rockets. But if you think about a rocket's just a sort of big bomb under a bit of control, large explosion that you're trying to manage. If you get it wrong, it's a very large explosion, so it will make a bit of an impact, shall we say, a bit of a mess. So they developed this process called failure mode effect analysis, and the more detailed failure mode effect and criticality analysis. And they were trying to understand what might go wrong, the seriousness, likelihood, and all the rest of it. And it was a formalized process now that everybody could get involved in to try to eliminate potential errors in launching rockets. Certainly it was encouraged and used in the 60s for getting the space race underway and getting man on the moon. And various organizations picked it up. Ford Motor Company is quite an interesting example. There was a car in the 70s called the Pinto, three-door hatchback. And Ford were aware of failure mode, but I understand that they weren't using it formally until they had a major problem with the Pinto, because they had a lot of these things in rear-end crashes that were catching fire and burning people to death. So they went back and had a look at the process and decided that they should have done a full failure mode effect. So they adopted it from then on, and the motor industry and various other manufacturing industries are using failure mode effect analysis to this day on a regular basis. Now, the difference between FMEA and some of the others is that it includes an extra step, the third criterion, that is detectability. So failure mode effect analysis is looking at the types of failure, the probability of occurrence of the failure, the severity of their failure, but because we're in a manufacturing environment, we include an extra measure, can we detect failure? Because if we can detect failure at the point of manufacture, and reliably we can stop that failure going any further down the line, then we stop that failure reaching the patient, reaching the user. And within manufacturing processes, we can have some form of QC checking to detect faults and failures within the manufacturing process. And in our industry, it would be inline monitoring, label detectors, checkweighers, vision systems, and distribution temperature monitors and alarms, temperature containers and the like. And of course, within facilities, temperature alarms, humidity detectors, and associated alarms. So there are various things that we can introduce and put into our processes. And I'm sure you're familiar, certainly on things like packaging lines. You'll have a blister line will have a camera system on the blister filler. It will have some sort of imprint detection to make sure that the print's being put on the carton properly, the variable data. There'll be a check weigher on the end of the line to make sure that the carton's got enough blisters in it and the leaflet's there. There'll be devices to check the barcodes on the leaflets and the cartons and so on and so forth. So we have lots of opportunity to put automated systems in place on our production machinery to try to eliminate the chance of something leaving the factory that's got some sort of fault with it. It's a process. Failure mode effect analysis is a process, and any process, if you follow the process and do what the process asks you to do, the process will deliver the results you're looking for. Where it goes wrong is where you've got a process and people try to jump things or leave things out. That's where you get caught. So with a process like failure mode effect analysis and a number of other recognized business processes, do follow the process. And if it's a 9-step process, do all 9 steps. Don't miss out 6 and 7 because you think you know better. First thing to do is get the team together, key stakeholders and players, and as with the flow charting, involve the people who do the job. The person doing the job is the expert in that job. Nobody knows the job as well as they do. Supervisors and managers don't. It's the person doing the job. And then get your information together, flowchart the process. And the way I normally do it is a very, very long sheet of brown paper on a wall, corridor, conference room, something like that, and just set to work with post-it notes. You can flowchart the whole process. You then populate that with any known facts and data, and hopefully you've got a lot of known facts and data about any process you're operating. And then start to think about the potential failure modes. Where, when, the circumstances, what can go wrong. And within those, what's the severity, the frequency, and ease of detection, should that failure occur. We look at our current controls. We think about the root cause of the failure, because the failure we see might not be initiated at that point in the process. It might have been initiated further up the process, further upstream. And then we think about what we can do to improve. What corrective actions can we put in place to reduce the risk, either by reducing the severity, reducing the frequency, increasing the detection, or perhaps a combination of those. And then we implement and monitor. Don't forget the importance of monitoring. And the way we do it with failure mode effect analysis is to put a little matrix together. So we'll build a matrix here, and I'm going to work on step 2, which is clean, clear, and check the line. So we get these steps off our flowchart. So that bit of work's already been done for us. The flowchart's up there, it's on the wall. We simply work along the flowchart and say, okay, well, we've got all these various steps that we do. We simply write them in the second column, and we number them for ease of reference later. I'm keeping this very simple. Step 2 here is clear, clean, and check the line. If you were doing it for real, you might even break that out into 3 separate steps: clearing the line, cleaning the line, checking the line, each of which could have their own set of failures. But hey, there's only so much room on the slide. We think about the critical control points within our process, and that is any point where we can prevent or eliminate a hazard. Or if you turn it on its head, where a hazard might be introduced, might occur. And again, in packaging operation, critical control points would be things like line clearance. Perhaps upstream it would be a dispensary. We could be talking about bulk blending or formulation, sterilisation, labelling, a whole host of things that we do. Various steps in our processes can hopefully reduce the hazard, but may be a point where the hazard is introduced. Obviously things like sterilisation, cleaning, you get it wrong, and that's going to show itself further down the line, if it's spotted at all. Now, a potential problem here, and I think I've missed a slide, have I? I am having computer troubles at the moment. No, we're there. So a potential failure mode here is the vats are unclean from the previous product, that they haven't been cleaned properly. And the effect of that on the product is that it's a contamination issue. So it's affecting the purity. We tend to use this little list of 4 things: purity, identity, efficacy, and safety. And in this case, it's going to affect purity. Good risk assessments. Now, this is one of the things that I see often goes wrong. People don't use a good risk assessment scale. Because when you're determining the severity, the frequency of the risk, you've got to have a measure that everybody can work to, everybody agrees with, and everybody would give the same score to. So don't go down the subjective route of having the high, medium, and low characterizations, because all you get then is somebody's opinion, and everybody's opinion is going to be different. Everybody's definition of high, medium, and low is likely to be different, and it invariably ends up with the person in the room who's the most senior or got the loudest voice who wins. So we want to have some established levels that are clearly and unambiguously defined and agreed by all participants. So some sort of agreed scale. And make it, at the very least, a 5-point scale. I prefer to use a 10-point scale, and the one I'm going to show you shortly is a 10-point scale for each of them. Because if you don't have a broad enough scale, for example, using the high, medium, low 3-point level, you get a lot of bunching, and you find everything ends up being scored the same, and then you can't separate and differentiate between the different failure modes. So a 10-point scale does give a nice spread, and it gives clear prioritization of the various failure modes, and that tells you which ones you should be working on first. Now, I've got an example I'm going to show you next, which is used widely, and it works very well in the pharmaceutical industry. It was, I spotted it first of all on a presentation given to an American conference organised by the PQRI, which is the Product Quality Research Institute, which is a tie-up between academia and the FDA. Now, there's a chap called Gadaka already presented this. He, at the time, worked for Johnson & Johnson. I liked it, thought it was very good. I know he didn't invent it. He borrowed it from somewhere, because I've seen other presentations predating this where this scale, with some of the wording changed slightly, has been used. I've made a slight modification to it myself in introducing it. But if we're looking at the severity of something going wrong, obviously the worst thing that could happen is we harm the user. So that scores a 10. And the best thing that could happen is it's be unnoticed and not affect the performance of the product. And then there's a scale in between. And if you look at these, and this is the thing I liked about this when I first saw it, they're really quite specific, and you can easily determine which level this potential risk is going to land on. Because loss of performance likely to result in a complaint is more serious than a minor performance loss, but not as serious as a partial malfunction. So you should be able to determine, looking at your failure mode, well, it must be a 5 for these reasons, it must be a 7 for these reasons. If there is any doubt, you say, well, we're not absolutely sure it's a 7 or an 8, always score it slightly higher, because that puts you on the safe side. Now, in our instance, if our vessels are cross-contaminated, that's going to give us an 8, and that was render the product or service unfit for use. And you'll have seen on the previous slide that I showed the top 4 are likely to end up in a product recall of some sort, either enforced or voluntary. The next scale, and this is the failure frequency rating scale. Now, that's not how often you do the job, it's how often the process fails in somewhere and produces a failure. Now, if it's a continuous process, you're doing it all day, every day, you can use the time period one. If it's something you do occasionally, perhaps you do a batch a month, then it's better to use the probability scale. But you should have historical data, you should have shop floor data telling you the sort of frequency that you're going to see failures occurring. Don't muddle them up. Either use one or the other. So if you're going to use the time period scale, stick to it. If you're going to use the probability scale, stick to it, because they're not an exact match across, but they're close. So something that you see a 1% failure, you're going to get a 7. Something that never happens, once every 6 to 100 years, a 1 in 2 billion failure, you're going to get a 1. So we can put our figure down here as well. And in our case, again, coincidentally, it scores an 8, because we're having a bit of a problem with this particular process step. We are not cleaning the vessels properly, and we're getting cross-contamination. Our current in-process control is inspecting the right close cleaning. It's a visual inspection. Somebody sticks their head in it, basically, and has a look around to see what's going on. Now, our inspection scale, our detection scale, if we can't detect the failure, it's a 10. If it's obvious and can be kept from affecting the customer, it's a 1. And then obviously there's a scale in the middle. A couple of things to point out to you. You notice that where we have automatic inspection with automated intervention, and this would be something such as a automatic detector on a packaging line looking for a missing label on a bottle, and there's an automated reject facility. So the detection equipment, the rejection equipment has been properly installed, properly maintained and validated, and we've got confidence in this piece of kit. It's an automatic process. It's inspecting every unit automatically, and it will reject anything that doesn't meet specification. That scores a very low score, number 2. If it's manual inspection, it's a 7, because unfortunately people aren't as reliable as pieces of machinery. If we've got some sort of mistake proofing modification in it, improves it slightly. So this might be a tablet count where we've got one of those little counting triangles that people use. but it's still, human inspection is unfortunately very fallible. There's some talk in there about SPC. I won't go into detail on it now because we don't have the time, but that's another area that is worth looking at. In our case then, it's a manual inspection and we've got a score of 7. The next step in the process, we multiply those three numbers together and we get a value, 448 in this example. And this is our risk priority number. The important word there being priority, because if we score the risks of all the other process steps, we will clearly see some have got a high score, some have got a low score. So we work on the things with the high score first. And some of the things with a very, very low score, we might say, well, yeah, it's fine, we'll live with it, we'll put up with that, that's fine. So this is the sort of classification table you might use. It is just an example, but it works quite nicely. You may say, well, if it's more than 700, we've got to change the process or implement some other action to reduce the RPN. But less than 200, then we won't do anything. We will monitor it, but we won't do anything at the moment. But consider if the severity is high, you may need to redesign the product. If it's the probability of occurrence that's high, then think about how reliable your processes are. And if it's detection that's an issue, what can you do to introduce automation or mistake proofing measures? Because that gives you a little bit of a steer as to where you're going to go next with this and how you're going to address the issues of risk. So we then put an action plan in. Okay, we're going to put a validated clean in place system in and have that done by the end of September. And we're going to be training our staff at the end of October. We then revisit our process, our risk assessment, and say, okay, well, if we do those things, how is it going to improve things? So we do the initial analysis, the as is now. We then do a second run through the RPN calculation based on, if we do this, what will we get? And it looks something like this. Now, cross-contamination seriousness doesn't change. We hope that if we put an automated cleaning system in, it will be better than the manual cleaning system that we've used at the moment. The system is fully automated and it's got locks on the system that you can't run a fresh batch until you've managed the previous batch. The cleaning system is validated, and that's the important thing, is there, validated clean in place. So that reduces our risk detection level from a 7 down to a 2. We've now got a risk priority number score of 80. So we've taken a high score of 448 down to 80. If we implement this, we've reduced the risk. So what we need to do is to make sure that when we do implement it, that we measure the risk again. Got to allow change to settle down. In change, in any organisation, any operation, any process, things often get worse before they get better. So you allow things to settle down, you allow people to become familiar with new ways of working, you make sure the equipment's working properly. Then you revisit and say, well, we said we were going to get a lower score of 80. Have we actually achieved that? Because if we haven't, we've got to go back again and have another look at it. Obviously, change control must be introduced for the SOPs, and then periodically we come back to our process and say, well, we've made a change, we anticipated that score, we achieved that score. 6 months, a year later, are we still achieving that score? And again, if we're not, we need to know why and need to do something about it. So just in summary, things can go wrong at any stage, any stage of our pharmaceutical supply chain, from discovery right through to prescription. If we adopt a risk-based approach to quality, it will help identify potential failures and prevent their occurrence. And that's what we want to do. And as I said earlier, and I've said many times, what the regulators want to see, what any auditor wants to see, is that the organisation has understood their process, they've understood the risks within the process, and they've taken the appropriate action. It's when you see that gap in the knowledge, or that gap in the analysis, or the implementation of change, that's when you start to worry. It's an expectation. If you don't do it, the regulators are likely to lean on you and lean on you fairly hard. Because they want to see robust processes where you've understood the process and you've understood and managed the risk. And it's applicable to all stages of the supply chain. So, if there are any questions, I would be very pleased to hear them.
Thank you so much, Bob. We have got some questions, so I'm going to work my way through them
Goody.
as we run through here. So let's kind of start with, perhaps we always like a good example. So have you got an example of where you've applied this risk assessment approach and it's been, and you can demonstrate where it's been really beneficial to the company?
Yeah, I was working with a company that produces radiopharmaceuticals. If I say they're just off the M25 in IMechE, probably a few people know who they are. And we were working through this in a series of workshops with them, looking at their processes, and they were being very conscientious about it. It was many, many, many years ago. They were an early adopter of risk-based approach, and I credit them for that. Where others were saying, "Oh no, it's all new stuff, and get out, you witch, you heretic." IMechE actually picked it up and ran with it. And we were looking at part of their process, because they're doing radiopharmaceuticals which have got a very, very short shelf life, often measured in hours because of the radioactive decay. And the patient could be halfway across the planet. They often have to ship things out by air, and being close to Heathrow Airport, that was their airport of choice. And one of the things that they identified as a major risk was actually getting to the airport, because anybody familiar with the M25 knows it can be a bit of an unknown. So a brainstorming activity, if we can use that term anymore, we said, okay, well, what are the alternatives? And they said, well, currently we're using a taxi or a van, local courier service, and so on and so forth, and they get stuck in traffic. So after a bit of brainstorming, we said, well, how big are these packages? And they said, well, not very, it's usually some sort of thermally insulated container, but it's not huge. Why not use a motorbike? The motorbike can get through the traffic very easily. The guys know where they're doing, where they're going. They're invariably going to be a lot quicker, and that actually mitigated the chance of getting caught in a major traffic jam. It's only if the road was closed completely they'd have to find another route. But again, they'd skim past the traffic. So yeah, it was a significant step for them to identify that.
So sometimes the solutions are not that complicated. It's just taking approach and thinking about them.
Okay. Yeah, and a motorbike's cheaper than a taxi, isn't it? So it's making money as well.
I love it. Hey, we've got another question here, because Bob, you referred to a lot of different tools and techniques that were listed in some of the slides. And okay, you've drawn down to talk about the FMEA one, but how do you know which is the best tool to use in kind of each situation? Or is the FMEA preferable because you've had more experience with it and find it more reliable? What's the recommendation?
FMEA has been the one that seems to have been the most popular within the industry. When this was first being talked about back in the early days, HACCP was looked at, which is the food standard. HACCP looks at severity and likelihood. Because if you think about food, the difference with food is the most likely risk is going to be some sort of microbial issue. And you can't detect that very easily at the point of production. If you've got contamination of chicken or milk products, dairy products and the like, you don't know until people have ended up in A&E. So HACCP works very well for food, and it is a food standard, but where we're doing manufacturing operations and distribution operations, usually we've got some way of detecting failure. So that is why FMEA has been picked up as the favoured one in the pharmaceutical industry. So yeah, it's an industry favourite. It's used in pharma, it's used in many other manufacturing industries. So I would suggest, yes, if you're in manufacturing, FMEA is your best one. But you don't have to, the regulators don't specify.
They don't say which one.
No, they just say you've got to do it. They don't say which one you've got to use. Okay,
got it, understood. We've got another question here about medical devices, because we've been talking about kind of pharmaceuticals. I suppose we tend to think of that as kind of pills and medicines. Is the same expectation for this risk-based approach for things like medical devices?
Yeah, my understanding that it is. It's the same regulator, and device GMPs are very similar to pharma GMPs. I know that the devices are based very much on the ISO standard, which in itself is based on ISO 9001. So 13485. I must confess I haven't read 13485 recently, but I'm pretty sure that there's a big chunk in there about using a risk-based approach. So I would say yes. And it makes good business sense, because what you don't want to do is to put stuff out into the market which is defective. If
No,
anybody's suffered a recall, you know.
no problem. We've got our last question, unless anybody's quick to type in the attendees' questions quite quickly. This one says, what are the benefits of process analytical technology that you have experienced?
I've not seen it used that much, unfortunately, which is a shame. It tends to be used more in bulk chemicals rather than secondary operations. The benefit is that it's telling you real time when things are not working properly. Probably the best example I've got from secondary is aseptic operations, where you've got things like autoclaves, clean in place, sterilise in place systems, where the online monitoring will tell you if something goes wrong, it will tell you straight away. When you're bashing tablets out of the tablet press, to a certain extent you've got it, because you're going to be looking at things like tablet thickness, tablet weights are being done automatically. But again, you're told immediately. So the big benefit of the PAT is the fact that it tells you when it's gone wrong. At the point, you can stop it, sort it. Don't waste a lot of product. Don't waste a lot of time. Rather than, as often did happen, and I suspect still does happen, you finish a batch, get it in the warehouse. 2 weeks later, somebody from QC says, "Oh, there's a problem," and you've got a whole batch of packed stock that's got to go in the bin or be reworked or something.
Makes a lot of sense.
Hmm.
So hang on one second. We have, I think, Salam's been really quick here to get the question in. Saying it was interesting to see manual inspection as a 7 on the detection scale. Have you ever implemented human reliability assessment, perhaps for a risk that might not be as severe, but would have a high rating in terms of detectability?
Honest answer is no, I haven't. The scoring system I showed you is an example, a suggestion. It was, as I say, I borrowed it from a presentation given by Mr. Reddy. You can modify it to suit, and if you think that 7 is a bit high and you've got justification for putting it on the lower score, then feel free to do so. It is only an example. It's not
hard and fast rule.
No, it isn't, and the guidance doesn't have a hard and fast rule. The guidance doesn't say which method you've got to use. The guidance doesn't say the GMPs don't say what scoring system you've got to do. But you need something that's robust and everybody agrees to. So yeah, if you've got an assessment that shows, yeah, it's not actually that serious.
And that's kind of your judgment. So, and from what you said, your inspector is not looking to rate your scoring; it's looking to see your thought process. Is that correct?
Yes, very much so.
Okay.
Just a thought about getting a product recall. It's another paper I present from time to time about cost of quality. For every pound, dollar, or euro you spend on prevention of defects, will save you 10 in detection of defects on site. Will save you 100 on which way round is it now? Preventive detection. 100 on internal failure, where it's spotted before it goes out the door. It will save you 1,000 on external failure, where the patient finds it or the customer finds it. Now, if anybody's ever suffered a major recall, you're talking about tens of millions. You're not talking about a few pounds. It's very, very expensive, and it can be career damaging. So you're far better to put your effort into preventing errors and defects than trying to sort the mess out when it goes pear-shaped.
Makes a lot of sense. So I'm looking now, and that's concluding our questions. So I think it's now down to me to say thank you so much, Bob. I loved all the examples you brought through. You took us in great detail, connecting to all the regulatory information, but also turned it into important practical examples so people can understand more about where this needs to be applied. So thank you ever so much. And I guess that concludes our webinar for today.
It does. And the recording of this will be available on the IMechE's channel.
Brilliant. Thank you. Right. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks very much. Bye now.